Welcome to Business Innovators Radio, featuring industry influencers and trendsetters sharing proven strategies to help you build a better life right now.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. This is guest host Donna Gunter. Today we have with us Chase DiMarco, founder and educator at FreeMedEd. Chase is an MS, MBA-HA, and MD-PhD candidate. He's the founder and educator at FreeMedEd, which he began in 2014 to consolidate free educational resources for his classmates. He also hosts the Medical Mnemonist Podcast and a 1-minute Preceptor Podcast, is Chief Development Officer at InsideTheBoards, and CEO of MedMatch Externships clinical rotation service. He's explored many facets of medical education, the psychology of learning, and accelerated learning techniques. Now with a passion to make studying easier for all students and bring great educational resources to the masses, he's worked to compile some of the top literature out there on educational psychology, academic medicine, and memory. Welcome to the show, Chase.
Thank you for having me on, Donna. And just for the audience, Medical Mnemonist is the podcast. I know it's really a weird word when you see it spelt out, but it's just like mnemonics.
Well, tell us a little bit about FreeMedEd and how you're helping your students.
Sure. So FreeMedEd began when I started my first semester at medical school, and I was struggling with some of the instruction, some of the teachers' abilities to decipher and distill the information for the students, and the vast difference in student knowledge became very apparent to me early on. So what I tried to do was just to start a website to compile free resources that were already out there. So online quizzes, YouTube videos, anything that could help my fellow classmates and myself and any other medical students that might need some supplemental information for their classes. So I began FreeMedEd just as a website of compiled information, and then slowly started to make my own content with that. So I came out with my first free course, which was published the end of 2017. And right after that, I started the Medical Mnemonist Podcast to sort of explore more detail and more evidence base for learning techniques and for using mnemonic techniques for remembering large quantities of information. So that's sort of how this started, and it's really blown up since then. Now I have the 2 podcasts on there that you mentioned, a recent book that was published, and just trying to find new ways to distill the latest in evidence-based information and accelerated learning techniques for medical students and really generally graduate learners and healthcare learners. They can all use this information.
Well, Chase, can you explain some of the benefits and advantages of the strategies that you use to make studying and learning easier for your med school students?
Well, learning is something that we're all expected to know, especially as you progress through different stages of academics and get to higher degrees seeking experiences. But really, for the most part, most of us are never really taught how to learn. So I try to focus on learning how to learn. And a lot of this comes down to the last few years of cognitive psychology, educational research, just the evidence base is exploding for certain techniques and how they are much more efficient. Like a lot of people think that rereading their notes or highlighting in a textbook might benefit them in remembering material better for their classes or for whatever, even professional exams that might be coming up. And this just has been proven time and time again not to be the case. So we really focus on what the evidence says a lot of the time, which a lot of it comes down to spaced repetition. So rehearsal practice, recalling information without any sort of primer, without looking at your notes, just kind of going over it in your head, but then spacing this out over time. A lot of times for students, we'll have an online software, flashcard program that'll already add this spaced repetition in for us. And then a lot of new material starting to come out regarding mnemonics training, and this goes into the accelerated learning. So learning the journey method of loci, which is also known as memory palaces, and some of these other visual memory techniques that can be much more robust and lead to longer term memorization of facts and information and concepts. We try to incorporate all of those into some of the interviews that I conduct on my podcast and to the educational material I have through the book, and hopefully pretty soon going to start consulting for some students that would like a little more one-on-one training.
Well, Chase, could you give an example of one of your strategies or techniques that somebody could use to make learning something easier? I mean, I know what I know about med school is based on watching television shows, of residents being run ragged, with 80 and 90 and 120-hour work weeks and being exhausted on their feet and trying to integrate studies and all of that. And, I hear some of the mnemonic techniques that they use, to memorize the bones of an arm or the bones in the chest or what have you, So I'd be interested in hearing one of your strategies to help make that learning easier.
Sure. So just real quick, for those that are not familiar with the course of an academic program in medicine, generally it's 4 years. The first 2 years is heavily lecture-based for most schools. This is kind of changing in some schools, but for the most part, the first 2 years, you're spending 6 to 8 hours a day in a lecture hall, sitting down, trying to memorize all these textbooks. I've seen students in the past stack up all of the textbooks that they were required to purchase, and it can reach the ceiling. And then the second 2 years mostly focuses on the clinical aspect of it. So seeing more patients, being under the supervision of a preceptor, a physician educator, and implementing the stuff that you learned through your first 2 years. So a lot of the accelerated learning and mnemonics techniques that I tried to emphasize and teach students about focuses on the first 2 years mostly, since that's the bulk of just the quantity of information that you're going to need to remember for your first board exam. One of the techniques that we can use very simply is called the journey method. And this is where you can create a story within a set of visual mnemonics that you've created, these visual markers. So for instance, let me see if I can think of something off the top of my head, something that would apply to your audience as well. All right, so you can change any sort of topic or number or any concept, any word, any phrase into a visual marker. And this visual marker is just a visual aid, something that's personal to you, something that first comes to your mind, or there are different techniques to create these visual images if you struggle at first. And then you can make a story with them. So a stupid little one that I used earlier today, just to remember a new radio station that I hadn't heard before, was I imagined a flower, like a cartoonish flower with arms sticking out, and it was playing hockey. And when it was playing hockey, instead of hitting a hockey puck, it was hitting a pencil, and was hitting this pencil into a large ocean. Now, someone might hear this and be, what are you talking about? I don't understand. What I did here was trying to remember the numbers of a new radio station I was not familiar with, and also the name of the radio station. And what this translates into was the station was 97.1, the ocean. So I already have a preset PEG system, is what you can, one tool for converting numbers into images. So for one of the images I use for a 9 is a flower. One of the images I use for a 7 is a hockey stick. And one of the images that I can use for the number 1 is a pencil. So by selecting this weird visual that it might make no sense to anyone else, but it made sense to me at the time, with the flower, number 9, playing hockey, number 7, and not using a hockey puck, but hitting a pencil instead, number 1, into the ocean, to remember that the station was called the ocean, then I have a little kind of visual marker that I can use for translating this information. If you just tell me a number, I'm probably going to forget it, but this visual, this wacky imagery sticks out a little bit more. And then you can continue on making longer and longer stories. And as you make these stories, it'll help you remember different sequences. So if you want to remember events instead of numbers, you can do that. You can add in different people's names. Really anything that you can translate into a visual marker can be used in this manner, in this technique. And then there are more advanced techniques as you progress.
Well, that's pretty fascinating. Now, how does that translate, though, into learning your academic coursework in med school?
So a lot of people say, well, I don't need to remember that much in medicine, and teachers seem to be getting behind this mantra. You need to know concepts, not memorize. And that's simply not true. You need to do both. There are tens of thousands of little facts and factoids that students have to remember for not only their quizzes and exams in their class, but also for their board exams. We have several board exams we need to take before we actually become the MD, before we get that license, before we get the degree, I mean. So using these techniques can really help promote, especially for difficult topics that students run into, promote a stronger, more robust memory later on. And there are a few companies out there, such as Mnemonic or Sketchy Medicine, that a lot of students use. They've become very popular in the past few years for having pre-made sets of these visual markers and these stories that students can watch. It's kind of like watching a cartoon and then translating all of the weird images back into testable material that you can recall. And it's associating everything. So if you have a certain scene, that's say a cartoon scene, then you know all of the topics within that scene are going to be related. So if you can remember bits and pieces, but not everything, you recall the scene and it'll help you remember some of the other facts. Now, what I try to focus on with my podcast and with the students that I talk to is creating your own visual markers and your own memory palaces. Because when you create it yourself, when you go through the process of translating and transcribing the information, first you have to make sure that you actually understand it well enough to do so. Kind of like discussing a topic with a friend or a spouse, make sure that you know it well enough. And then you have to go through the effort of translating it into this visual image. And just the process of doing that is seemingly much more robust than, for instance, writing it down on a piece of paper and then not looking at it again for a few days and then trying to cram before your exams. So it gives students a lot of different ways to be creative with their studying, to add more interest in the studying, and to remember things for a longer period of time.
Oh, I can imagine it does. Some of what you're talking about I can relate to. Of course, I didn't use a strategy that was that in-depth, I guess, as I was studying for undergrad and grad school, and I wasn't in med school. So, the number of things I had to remember, very specific things like anatomy and physiology, were not as robust as somebody might have to memorize or remember in med school. But I can relate to setting kind of visual markers for myself, or seeing it in my head is what I call it, to remember something. So it's very interesting that you've really taken that, or I guess the whole field of learning has taken that and really developed that pretty intensely to an entire system. I wonder, though, it almost sounds like that it takes a while for you to develop your own system before you can then use it to actually help you remember things. Is that the case?
It definitely can, and this is one of the complaints I hear the most from students. So I try to bridge the gap between what students are sort of wanting and their basis of knowledge, and then a lot of memory champions and memory instructors that I've interviewed in the past. And obviously the experiences that each one has and the knowledge base they have is vastly different. So trying to meld these together can be difficult. A lot of students struggle with it more so than others, but that's why we we advise students to start just practicing, even if it's things you're not going to know or care about later on or remember for a long period of time, to get down the skill set first, to develop your creativity, and you start to develop this visual dictionary. So there are certain images that you can reuse later on when there's a similar or the same topic is brought back up. So the more students actually practice the techniques and develop it bit by bit, just a little bit each day, the stronger they become at them. It's definitely not something that you can learn overnight or really even in just a few weeks and then give up. It's a constant process of developing new and more creative visuals, reusing old visuals in new ways, and then starting to implement them with stronger techniques, such as, I know we haven't gone into it, but I've mentioned a few times, the memory palace. And that's something that we kind of teach after they have a little bit more of the visual dictionary down, they get some of the basics down, then they can start placing them in these palaces, which a memory palace is a fancy term for any sort of visual scenario, house, outdoors, even people use video games, any kind of scene that you can use, and then you can place these visuals within the scene. And it helps to clump everything together, and cluster them by topic or by similarities or by discipline a little bit better.
Well, Chase, I know there are a lot of myths and misconceptions out there when it comes to studying in med school, and I know your strategies there are helping people overcome some of those. What are some of the issues that you're dealing with as people think about tackling their med school academic curriculum?
There are definitely a lot of myths and misconceptions in medicine. I think one of the big ones that I really run into, and it might sound contradictory to what I've been saying so far as trying to increase everyone's memory and their abilities to do better on their tests and everything, is really that students focus too much, and not just students, their academic advisors, residency directors, everyone in medicine focuses too much on these board exams. They're a huge, huge, huge source of stress for students. Academics in general, we don't have a good grasp on what they're actually testing. They're not actually testing better patient outcomes or patient care. They're really testing your ability to memorize facts and take exams better. But unfortunately, since they're being used as a benchmark for students for getting into a residency of choice later on, they really place a lot of stress and strain on the student. And I try to always emphasize that as much as it's important to pass these tests and do as well as you can, obviously, don't focus too much on the tests. Don't focus on your peers. Don't try to compete against them. You're really just, whenever you're doing your dedicated study practices, you need to focus on yourself. You need to try to beat your last score. And that's the only thing that matters. So focusing too much on some of the things that might come later on, your class ranking, your board exam scores, these are not necessarily going to matter once you get into residency or once you're a physician, and getting too overwhelmed early on just adds to your burnout.
Yeah, I guess there's this adage that I've heard repeated that's not quite like this, so I'm ad-libbing a little bit, but, it's along the lines of, well, what do they call out of a class of 200? The person who ranks 200th in the class, they still call him a doctor. So I think you have a lot of validity in what you're talking about not worrying about class rankings as long as you're getting the information.
Exactly. And when I was doing my clinical rotations, every preceptor I had said, don't worry about your scores. Nobody cares about your scores once you get into residency. Now, the argument is, well, I need to get into residency. But yeah, as long as you do okay, as long as your scores are all right, you're going to get in somewhere. You can do some extracurriculars. You can do some extra research if you need to add to your CV a little. But as long as you're persistent and you have a good work ethic and they can see that, then you're going to make it.
And of course, there's that old adage that if somebody walks into a doctor's office and they look at the diplomas on the wall, nobody asks, well, what was your ranking, when you graduated from such and such med school, or what was your GPA? Of course, that applies to any degree, I think, in any field. And so that's a lot of worrying, I think, that we do in school that doesn't come to amount to anything.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, let's talk about some fears common fears, I should say, that med school students have about success. What are some of those fears, and what can you tell our listeners to allay some of those fears?
Well, the fears go far and wide. Obviously, like the last topic we were discussing, everyone fears, passing your courses, getting good grades, getting good scores on the board exams, getting into the residency they want, getting into a specialty they want. And your board scores and everything else can be a factor in this. But really, even further than that, I've heard so many stories of students that they're afraid of what their parents will think. Oh, I'm not number one in the class anymore. Well, you might have been number one all through your undergraduate, but now you're with all the other number ones too. So it's much more competitive, and having these really high expectations, these fears of failure or not being the top of the class, it really doesn't benefit in any way. It doesn't help the student out, again, adding to extra stress, anxiety. And I think the first step in kind of mitigating those fears would just be to understand that fact. No one really puts it into context that, yeah, now you're in a class with 50, 60, 70 other people that were probably all close to the top of their classes previous to getting to med school. It's hyper competitive. It's very stressful. There's a lot of angst about not knowing what to expect and about the instructors not preparing you for the exams properly. And there's a lot of truth to that too. And I think the best way to mitigate some of these fears is one, just to have a good guide, a mentor, whether that be a peer mentor or a physician or someone that has gone through the experience before, that knows what you're going through, someone that you can trust and open up to. I think that's a huge part of it. And also just planning properly. So planning to fail once in a while too. And what will you do when you come across that failure point? Planning for classes, planning your time management and what materials you want to cover. And you can always change these plans, but the more structured I say your plan is initially, the less you'll be worrying about it in the back of your mind as you go through and come across these difficult times, these trying times with medical school, with other students, sometimes not being the most friendly, with certain instructors not teaching you properly or to the degree that you expected. So planning and mentorship can go a long way to alleviating a lot of the fears that medical students have.
What are some great ways to find a mentor? It would seem like in this hyper-competitive environment that perhaps another med student is not going to be a good mentor because it's almost like dog-eat-dog world. Each person is out for himself or herself. So what can you tell us about how to find a great mentor to help you through this kind of situation?
Yeah, that is definitely a problem, especially with all the type A personalities in medical school.
Right.
It's even more detrimental now with social media and certain doctor and student forums online that they really just increase your anxiety even more. They're not a good place to find someone. There are some resources out there where you can find like tutors, mentors, coaches. They go by different names, depending on what type of service you're looking for. If you need more of a social support, that would be more of a coach, most likely. I'm not too aware of these as much for medical students, except for potentially through the school's resources, like maybe a counselor or something to that degree. When you can't find that, you always try to have family support or even peer support. Again, it helps if it's someone that's actually been through the process before or is going through it with you. But if you can't find that, there's always family, there's friends. Sometimes I'll just talk to my dog. That's the best support system. She'll sit there and listen to me and then give me a little lick on the cheek, and it's perfect. And there are a lot of resources out there as far as podcasts and YouTube videos and stuff like that. And generally, the people that are out there making these materials, they want to connect with students. They want to help. So it's surprising. I've been doing the Medical Mnemonist Podcast now for about a year. Actually, I think I just came up to a year this week. And I've only had maybe a dozen people reach out to me regarding that show. And a lot of it had nothing to do with asking me anything personally. It's just, hey, I like the show, or I didn't like that guest you had on, or something like that. But we're putting a lot of time into free resources for students. You might as well at least try to reach out through email, through social media. Some will respond, some won't. But if nothing else, it's worth a shot, and maybe they can guide you somewhere as well.
Well, that's a great point in terms of reaching out to people like you who are doing podcasts and other types of social media related or online related forums or television shows, YouTube shows, et cetera, or even Facebook Lives for that matter, or LinkedIn Lives on these issues. It never hurts to reach out to those folks at all.
Exactly.
Well, can you share an example of how you've helped your students overcome some of these obstacles and fears that they've faced and help them be successful in their med school journey?
All right. Well, let's take this in a few parts then. For mnemonics training in particular, especially when I was in school and even when I started the podcast, the first one, there were very few resources out there to really teach students how to make their own mnemonics, how to make these visual markers, how to put them in a story or to place them in a memory palace, what rules to follow or to avoid. Just there's a big learning curve to trying a new technique like this. It's kind of like developing learning a new language. You have to develop all these different visual and verbal skills in order to make the correct associations and remember them over time. So I do hope that at least as far as the memory techniques and the evidence-based practices like space retrieval and elaboration of techniques and retrieval practice, recall practice, these are something that I hope I'm explaining much better for students and the audience that listens to my podcast, that they can learn from it, that they can implement these techniques. I try to not only explain the principle of it, but give examples of how to put it into practice. And a lot of a lot of examples out there that are pre-made by someone else just might not be relevant to the student. So teaching you how to make your own is really, really important, I feel. Something that seems to be echoed by a lot of my guests that are in memory development and that teach these techniques. You can't remember other people's. In general education, I'm trying to also branch into more of a sort of tutoring, coaching, mentorship aspect myself, and starting to get into more of clinical medicine guidance. That's what the second podcast, the 1 Minute Preceptor, is about. So I'd like to develop as much of a well-rounded pathway of guidance of resources for students so that they can overcome these issues of not knowing how to use these techniques or not implementing them properly, or what happens when they hit a roadblock, or what are they going to expect on the next stage of their academic journey. So I'm trying to answer as many of these questions as possible throughout my other materials and through the new book that recently came out. I really do hope that prevents students from hitting a lot of the obstacles and the problems that I ran into, and I hear from a lot of other students as well that they ran into. So I guess just making it easier for them to succeed in their academic and life in general.
So Chase, I have to ask this question. How do you balance being in school yourself with all these podcasts that you're doing, the resources online that you're providing? How does that all balance out into your own educational process?
Well, I've always been one to balance too many things. And that's often been problematic. But for instance, I was taking my PhD coursework when I started medical school, and that was kind of problematic. But then as I continue, I actually recently, well, I guess not recently now, a little over a year ago, finished my clinical rotations, which is the 3rd and 4th year of medical school. And I've taken a year off to focus more on some of these educational materials, on the 2 podcasts, on the book, on there's an app that I have coming out, which you mentioned at the beginning, the MedMatch Externships. That's going to be the company that is going to be the face of this new app. So that's another student education platform that I don't want to get into too many details right now because it's too early for it. But I think having a lot of planning done, like I've kind of emphasized earlier, having plan A, plan B, what happens when this screws up or when you fail at this point, having a plan for that plan has helped me juggle a lot. But also this past year, luckily, I have been fortunate enough to take a year off from not going straight into residency or anything like that, and having some time to work on these extracurricular activities and really develop them out for our students before I once again become too busy.
Well, one of these extracurricular activities you mentioned a couple of times is your book that has recently come out, Read This Before Medical School. Tell us a little bit about the publishing process and how that came to be and what somebody can find in that book.
Oh, definitely. It was another good thing. It was a labor of love. Otherwise, it probably would have been trashed a long time ago. I started just I'm always taking notes. I have notes for everything. I have notes for like 4 other potential books going currently that may never see the light of day. But this one started off with a compilation of things that I had wanted to know in medical school, with problems other students had come to me with, and with a lot of advice that I had learned through my educational psychology degree and from the interviews that I was conducting with the Medical Mnemonist Podcast. So all of these expert interviews, taking the best pieces of all of that. And I wrote the first draft of this book, and then I brought on 2 other physicians to give their advice and their experiences as well. So collaborating with them, the 3 of us published this book in October, I believe it was. And we had a lot of issues with too many chefs in the kitchen and how do we organize this and where's this graphic going to go, and then having to get different graphics remade so that we weren't worried about copyrights. Ended up eventually we're going to self-publish, but found an independent publishing company, which a lot of them are basically just a lot of independent authors that kind of group together and help each other out and make it much more affordable while still providing a little more benefit than you might get from just self-publishing. So we kind of went that route. Had tons of issues with Amazon and some of the other distributors kicking things back for this error on the cover or this not being formatted properly in the document. And all said and done, now it's out, and those that have purchased
You're giving birth.
Yeah. And it seems like it has a very good reception from those that have read it so far. Anyone that wants to find out more information about the book, or we also have a free PDF for students to go and download if they would like, and this can be found on our FreeMedEd website. So that's freemeded.org/medstudent. And that'll bring you straight to the page. You can download the PDF there, or you can go on Amazon, download the book. It has something that we coined as the MedEdge method. So giving you an edge over the other students. And it's our very unique test-taking process that really consolidates a lot of information into a couple of simple rules on a couple of pages. And I think if students were to start off with something like that, not even just for medicine, but for other test-taking procedures, then it would give them a great way to monitor their own successes, monitor their failures, know where they need to focus their future concentration on, and how to improve on that. So we really give a lot of techniques and tips and stuff in there for really education in general.
Well, it doesn't sound like you need any other additional balls to throw in the air and try to keep going. But it sounds like some of the strategies, or actually many of the strategies that you talk about, would be applicable for law school as well. Do you have any plans to branch out into that arena?
That is something I've thought about over the past year, and currently discussing with a student that is trying to get into law school right now. And if she does, then that would be a good platform, so I can kind of follow her through our education and combine these techniques with her experiences and go from there. Or if anyone else knows someone currently in law school or a recent graduate that would like to work on a similar project, or so our book is called Read This Before Medical School. We could do a Read This Before Law School and have you co-author it. And I'd be definitely open to something along those lines. I do think a lot of the basic, probably 80-90% of the book would coincide very well. The only difference would be the type of exam. So our exam process is very different. But other than that, the rest of the information is very generalizable. A lot of it seems like common sense even, but we have over 300 citations, many of which are peer-reviewed citations in there. So we know that to the best of our ability to research these on a limited time scale, these are the best techniques for your health, for time organization, for spiritual development, and then, of course, for study techniques and test-taking techniques.
Well, Chase, as people, or maybe med school students, take a look at all the educational resources that are out there available for them to make their journey through medical school a more painless process, or as painless as it can become. What are things that people should keep in mind as they're evaluating educational resources to help them with something like this?
There are a ton of resources out there, so it's very easy to get lost. I did that when I started too. I wanted to grab everything out there and pick and choose the best parts of each resource, and it's just not efficient to do that. Pretty much everyone that's tried that method, including myself, recommends you don't do that. Pick some of the top resources, because if you get a top resource and you memorize that completely, even if it only has 80% of the information, but you memorize that one thing, then you're good. You're going to get at least 80%, and then plus a little bit extra from your personal experiences and maybe class study. But if you get 10% from this resource, 10% from that, 10% from that, and then a lot of it overlaps, well, you might only end up with 30, 40, 50% of the information. But in order to pick the right resource, I would say there are a couple of questions you should ask, and that is, remember who the individual or group is that's making the resource. What are they charging for this research? And then do they have any evidence to back up what they're saying? So you'll get a lot of people that are a lot of resources out there that are very praised on forums and such, but they might only have anecdotal evidence. And that's fine. If a lot of other students are benefiting, then you might as well. But if there's more than anecdotal evidence, if there's actual clinical evidence or statistical significant peer-reviewed evidence for certain techniques, then that's going to be much stronger. If they're charging thousands of dollars, you might want to second guess it, even if they're one of the larger names out there, because there might be something for a fraction of the cost that will supply just as equivalent knowledge, but maybe be more affordable for you. But understanding who it is and sort of what their purpose is. Are they really there to help you, or are they a large business that's really, trying to keep the money flowing, can really help guide students. And also, when, as you probably know as a podcaster, listen to podcasts. They often have recommendations on their shows. They'll have guests on that they will stand behind. Most of the guests I've had on my show, I do know are pretty good resources. So you can get a lot of free information that way, and recommendations, and even interviews from a lot of these authors and company owners and stuff like that. So you can base it off of more than just a website.
Well, speaking of resources, how can our listeners find out more about you and FreeMedEd and the other resources that you have available to help them out?
So obviously FreeMedEd.org is our main website, and from there we do have links to the 2 podcasts and to the book in case there's too many names being thrown out here. And FreeMedEd also has pretty much all the social media accounts out there, so you can search us there and find it. I do have a couple of specific social media accounts for the Medical Mnemonist Mastermind, because that has more of a developing community around students that are specifically interested in developing mnemonics for graduate level education. So you can search those out. And you can also find me, Chase DiMarco, more likely to accept a LinkedIn request than some of the other social media channels. They seem to be, I get a lot more spam and stuff like that from those. But most information can definitely be found at freemeded.org.
All right, great. Thanks, Chase, for being our guest today on Business Innovators Radio. I appreciate all of you listening to today's episode. Take care, and we'll see you soon on our next episode.
Thanks for listening to Business Innovators Radio. To hear all episodes featuring leading industry influencers and trendsetters, visit us online at businessinnovatorsradio.com today.